The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the usual mid-flight chatter. First class was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy like the calm before a storm. And then it happened. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you need to move to your assigned seat. Now!" The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. Her tone was sharp, her face twisted in a mix of frustration and something darker, something that made the other passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The woman she was addressing sat perfectly still. She was elegant, her dark skin glowing under the cabin lights, her posture poised despite the tension in the air. She looked up slowly, her eyes locking with the flight attendant's. "I am in my assigned seat," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. The flight attendant, Claire, wasn't having it. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Listen, I don't know how you got up here, but first class is for paying customers, not stowaways." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some pulling out their phones, sensing that this was about to get ugly. The woman didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulling out her boarding pass and holding it up for Claire to see. "As you can see, this is my seat. 2A. First class, paid for and confirmed." Claire snatched the boarding pass, her eyes scanning it quickly. For a moment, it seemed like she might back down, but then her lips curled into a sneer. "This has to be fake. There's no way." Before anyone could react, Claire's hand shot out, slapping the woman across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and shocking. Passengers froze, their phones now fully out, recording every second. The woman's head snapped to the side, but she didn't cry out. She didn't even raise a hand to her cheek. Instead, she turned back to Claire, her expression unreadable. The cabin was dead silent, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. And then, the woman spoke, her voice low and calm, but with an edge that sent chills down everyone's spines. "You have no idea who you just messed with." The screen fades to black. Amara Johnson wasn't always the woman who could buy a plane with a snap of her fingers. Her story began in a small, crumbling apartment in Detroit where the walls were thin, the winters were brutal, and hope was a luxury few could afford. She was just 12 years old when she lost her parents in a car accident. One moment, they were there, her mother's laughter filling the room, her father's strong hands fixing everything that broke. The next, they were gone, and Amara was left in the care of an aunt who barely had enough to feed her own kids. But Amara was different. Even as a child, she had a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished. While other kids played outside, she spent hours at the library, teaching herself to code on an old, donated computer. She didn't know it then, but those late nights, typing away in the glow of a flickering screen, were the first steps toward building an empire. By the time she was 18, Amara had created her first app, a simple budgeting tool designed to help people like her aunt manage their finances. It wasn't much, but it caught the attention of a tech investor who saw something special in her. With his backing, Amara launched her own company, Johnson Tech, and the rest, as they say, is history. Fast forward 15 years, and Amara Johnson is a billionaire. Her company is a household name, her innovations changing the way the world works. But despite her success, Amara has never forgotten where she came from. She's the kind of woman who still takes the bus when she can, who volunteers at homeless shelters on weekends, and who insists on flying commercial instead of private, even though she could easily afford it. "It keeps me grounded," she once told a reporter. "I never want to lose touch with the real world." Which is why, on this particular day, Amara found herself in seat 2A of a commercial flight, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. To anyone looking, she was just another passenger. But this wasn't just any flight. Amara was on her way to finalize the biggest deal of her career, a merger that would solidify Johnson Tech as the leading tech company in the world. She'd chosen to travel incognito, partly to avoid the media frenzy, but mostly because she wanted to experience the flight as herself, not as the billionaire. As the plane took off, Amara leaned back in her seat, scrolling through her emails. She was calm, focused, ready for whatever lay ahead. But then, the confrontation with Claire happened. The slap, the silence, the stares. For a moment, Amara felt a surge of anger, the kind that could make a lesser person lash out. But then she took a deep breath, reminding herself of who she was and what she stood for. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. As she sat there, her cheek still stinging, Amara made a decision. This wasn't going to end with an apology or a quiet resolution. No, this was going to be a moment the world would never forget. Claire had been a flight attendant for 7 years, and if she was being honest, she hated every minute of it. The long hours, the demanding passengers, the endless smiles she had to fake. It was exhausting. But what really got to her were the people who thought they were better than her, the ones who snapped their fingers, demanded extra champagne, and treated her like she was invisible. Over the years, Claire had developed a sharp tongue and a quick temper. She didn't suffer fools gladly, and she had a particular disdain for anyone she thought didn't belong in first class. People who looked like they couldn't afford it, who didn't fit the image of a first-class passenger. And in her mind, Amara Johnson was one of those people. From the moment Amara boarded the plane, Claire had her doubts. She didn't recognize her, and Amara's understated elegance didn't scream wealthy to Claire. In her mind, Amara must have used some kind of trick to upgrade her seat, maybe a stolen credit card or a fake boarding pass. As the flight went on, Claire's frustration grew. She watched Amara from the corner of her eye, her assumptions hardening into certainty. When she finally approached Amara, it wasn't just about the seat, it was about proving a point. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you need to move to your assigned seat. Now." Claire's voice was sharp, her tone dripping with condescension. She expected Amara to shrink back, to apologize and move to economy where she belonged, but Amara didn't. She held her ground, her calm demeanor only fueling Claire's anger. "I am in my assigned seat," Amara said, her voice steady. Claire's jaw tightened. She snatched the boarding pass from Amara's hand, her eyes scanning it quickly. For a moment, she hesitated. The pass looked legitimate, but then her pride kicked in. There was no way this woman belonged in first class. "This has to be fake," Claire muttered, more to herself than to Amara. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers were watching now, their eyes darting between Claire and Amara. Claire could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure building inside her. And then, without thinking, she did the unthinkable. Her hand shot out, slapping Amara across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. For a moment, Claire felt a surge of satisfaction, but then she saw the look in Amara's eyes. Calm, chilling, and utterly unshaken. And in that moment, Claire knew she'd made a terrible mistake. The slap came out of nowhere. One moment, Amara was sitting calmly in her seat, her boarding pass in hand, ready to prove her point. The next, Claire's palm struck her cheek with a force that made her head snap to the side. The sting was immediate, a sharp, burning sensation that spread across her face. Amara's breath caught in her throat, her body freezing for a split second as her mind processed what had just happened. The cabin fell silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Amara's first instinct was to react, to stand up, to shout, to demand justice. Her heart pounded in her chest, her fists clenched at her sides. But then she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her. She thought about the countless times she'd been underestimated, overlooked, or outright disrespected because of the color of her skin. She thought about the young girls who looked up to her, the employees who depended on her, the world that watched her every move. If she lashed out now, she'd be giving Claire exactly what she wanted, a reason to paint her as the angry black woman. No, Amara wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, she turned back to Claire, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with a quiet intensity. The cabin was still silent, every passenger watching, waiting to see what she would do. Amara's voice was low, steady, and filled with a power that made Claire take a step back. "You have no idea who you just messed with." The words hung in the air, a promise and a warning all at once. And in that moment, everyone on the plane knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Every eye was on Amara, every breath held as they waited to see what she would do next. Claire stood frozen, her hands still tingling from the slap, her face a mix of defiance and growing unease. She had expected Amara to cry, to shrink back, or maybe even to lash out. But this calm, chilling response? This was something she hadn't prepared for. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout or demand an apology. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her gaze never leaving Claire's, and said, "Call the pilot, now." Her tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Claire hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to refuse, to tell Amara she had no right to make demands. But something in Amara's eyes, a quiet authority, a confidence that couldn't be faked, made her think twice. With a huff, Claire turned on her heel and marched toward the cockpit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The passengers watched her go, their whispers filling the cabin like a low hum. A few minutes later, the pilot emerged, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. He scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on Amara. For a moment, he looked confused, and then his face lit up with recognition. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice warm and respectful. "I had no idea you were on this flight. Is everything all right?" The cabin erupted in murmurs. Ms. Johnson? Who was this woman, and why was the pilot treating her like royalty? Amara stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Thank you for coming, Captain," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of someone used to being in charge. "I'm afraid there's been an incident. This flight attendant," she gestured to Claire, who was now standing stiffly by the galley, "has assaulted me in front of everyone here. I'd like to address this immediately." The pilot's face darkened. He turned to Claire, his voice sharp. "Is this true?" Claire opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Amara continued, her tone steady but firm. "I don't take such matters lightly, especially when they happen on one of my own planes." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, like a wave, the realization swept through the cabin. One of my own planes. Amara Johnson wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a billionaire. She was the owner of the airline. Claire's knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of a seat to steady herself. Her face went from pale to ghostly white, her earlier defiance replaced by sheer panic. She had slapped the woman who owned the plane, the woman who could end her career with a single word. The passengers erupted into chatter, their phones out, recording every second of the unfolding drama. Amara, however, remained calm, her expression unreadable. She turned to the pilot. "Let's land this plane," she said. "We have a lot to discuss." And with that, the cabin fell silent once more, the weight of Amara's words settling over everyone like a storm cloud. As the plane taxied to the gate, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Amara and Claire, who sat slumped in a crew seat, her face buried in her hands. The weight of what had just happened was crushing her, and for the first time she looked small, vulnerable, even. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, Amara stood, her presence commanding the attention of everyone on board. She smoothed her sweater, took a deep breath, and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority, "I want to apologize for the disruption today. What happened here was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility as the owner of this airline." The cabin was silent, every ear tuned to her words. "The flight attendant who assaulted me," Amara continued, her gaze briefly flicking to Claire, "will be fired immediately and banned from working for this airline or any of its affiliates. Behavior like this has no place in our company or anywhere else." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin, but Amara wasn't finished. "However," she said, her tone softening, "I believe in second chances. Claire will be offered the opportunity to attend a comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program paid for by Johnson Tech. If she completes it and demonstrates genuine growth, she'll be given a chance to rebuild her career somewhere else." The passengers exchanged surprised glances. This wasn't the vindictive punishment some had expected. It was a chance for redemption, a lifeline thrown to someone who had clearly hit rock bottom. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of Amara's offer sank in. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand the gravity of her actions, not just the slap, but the prejudice that had led her to it. I don't know what to say," Claire stammered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong." Amara nodded, her expression firm but not unkind. "Apologies are a start," she said. "But real change takes work. I hope you'll take this opportunity to do better, not just for yourself, but for everyone you encounter." Claire broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. The passengers watched, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. But one thing was clear: this was a moment no one would forget. As Amara stepped off the plane, her head held high, she knew this wasn't just about Claire. It was about setting an example, about showing the world that even in the face of hatred, there's room for grace and for change. Within hours of the plane landing, the video of the incident went viral. It spread like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and talk shows. The clip of Claire slapping Amara, followed by the shocking reveal of Amara's identity, was everywhere. The world was outraged, but also inspired. Comments flooded in from every corner of the globe. Amara Johnson is a queen. The way she handled that situation, pure class. This is why representation matters. Never judge someone by their appearance. Claire got what she deserved, but Amara's grace, that's next level. Amara didn't shy away from the spotlight. Instead, she used it as a platform to make a difference. At a press conference the following week, she announced the launch of the Johnson Aviation Equity Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to combating racism and promoting diversity in the aviation industry. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," Amara said, her voice steady and powerful. "It's a symptom of a much larger problem. This foundation will ensure that no one, passenger or employee, ever has to endure what I did." The announcement was met with thunderous applause. Donations poured in, and major airlines pledged their support. Amara had turned a moment of pain into a movement for change. A month later, Amara boarded another flight. This time, the crew greeted her with smiles and respect, their eyes filled with admiration. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached her, holding a small note. "Miss Johnson," the attendant said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Amara smiled, her heart full. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. As the plane took off, she looked out the window, the world stretching out below her. This was just the beginning.